Graham Mercer came home from a rescue flight to find his airstrip turned into a field of torn earth. His plane lay crushed beneath the tracks of a bulldozer, its fuselage split in half, its wings folded like paper. In the middle of the wreckage stood Lenora Whitlock, president of the Homeowners Association, holding out a demolition invoice and announcing that the land had been seized for a golf course. She warned him that resistance would end in his arrest. Graham said nothing. He simply picked up the federal warning sign the crew had torn from the fence and asked her a single question: had she ever bothered to read it? The truck rolled down the gravel road toward Redstone Hollow, Montana, 3 days after Graham had flown emergency medical equipment to a ranger station buried in snow. From a distance, he noticed something wrong. The windsock that had marked the runway for years was gone. The line of pines along the access road had been cut down, and the security fence lay flattened in the mud like it had never existed. He slowed the truck without realizing his hands had tightened on the wheel. Some old instinct from years of flying telling him that whatever waited ahead was already a disaster in progress. When he reached the strip, the sight stopped him cold. Nearly a mile of packed runway had been torn apart by heavy machinery, the surface gouged into ridges of broken earth. The runway lighting system lay in pieces, wires exposed and crushed. The hangar door had been ripped from its hinges and dragged aside, and there, tilted beneath a mound of displaced dirt and rock, sat his de Havilland Beaver, the plane he had spent 9 years restoring by hand. The engine had been caved in. The left wing sheared off at the root, and deep tread marks scarred the fuselage where the machines had rolled straight over it. Lenora stood beside Warren Pike and a small crew of HOA employees watching the scene with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had won. She had even brought someone to film the moment, calling it a victory for the community before Graham had said a single word. She handed him a printed notice the moment he stepped out of the truck. It declared the airstrip an unpermitted structure, blamed it for excessive noise and falling property values, and billed him $186,000 for the cost of demolition payable within 30 days, or the association would place a lien on his land. Graham asked her calmly who had given her the authority to cross his fence and destroy an aircraft that belonged to him. Lenora answered that the association held emergency powers to address any hazard threatening the residents of Silver Pines Estates. When Graham pointed out that his property had never belonged to the association in the first place, she told him the board had just voted to expand its jurisdiction, and that every property within 3 miles now fell under the new rules, whether the owners liked it or not. She said it with the tone of someone reading from a script she had already rehearsed a dozen times. Graham did not raise his voice. He walked the perimeter in silence, checking what remained of the security cameras, gathering broken fragments of the warning signs and photographing the tread marks pressed into what used to be his runway. Lenora mistook his quiet for surrender, the way people who are used to getting what they want often do. Before she climbed back into her car, she told him that by the end of the week, this ground would be the 9th hole of the new Silver Pines golf course. Graham looked at the plane crushed under the dirt and told her without any heat in his voice that she should cancel the entire project right now. She laughed at him. Graham reached down into the mud and pulled up a bent metal sign, wiping the dirt from its surface so the lettering could be read: Authorized Federal Aviation Operations, Restricted Access. Lenora glanced at it for less than a second before tossing it back into the mud as if it meant nothing at all. She had no idea that the sign she had just discarded was about to become the most important piece of evidence in the case that would end her career, her freedom, and every plan she had spent months building in secret. Once her convoy of trucks pulled away, Graham stood alone amid the wreckage and dialed a number that did not appear in any local directory. He said only one sentence into the phone. Someone had just destroyed Aviation Station 14. There was a pause on the other end, several seconds of silence, before a voice asked whether the damage had been confirmed. Graham looked again at the plane buried under the dirt, at the shredded lighting system, at the flattened fence that had once marked federal land. Confirmed, he said. And the people responsible are still standing at the scene. The following morning, Graham drove into town to file a report with the county sheriff's department. Deputy Nolan Briggs took the complaint with visible reluctance, suggesting this sounded like a civil dispute between a landowner and a homeowners association rather than a criminal matter. He recommended that Graham hire an attorney instead of pushing for anyone to be arrested the way officers sometimes do when they would rather the problem simply disappear from their desk. Graham laid out everything he had: ownership documents for the aircraft, security footage showing the bulldozer crossing through the gate, video of Lenora directing workers as they crushed the lighting system. A recording of her declaring the land would become a golf course. Nolan's confidence began to crack as he reviewed the material, though he still insisted the department needed to verify who legally owned the land before taking any action. While Graham waited for a response, Lenora called an emergency meeting of the association and told residents that an illegal airstrip had finally been removed for the good of the neighborhood. She laid out an ambitious plan for an 18-hole golf course, a private resort wing, and a new residence clubhouse. promising that home values across the community could rise by 25 to 40% once construction was complete. She never mentioned that a development company had already agreed to pay the association a cooperation fee of $3,800,000, and she never mentioned that the final hole of that golf course sat squarely on Graham's private land. Marissa Vance, the vice president of the association, asked in front of the room whether the board had actually purchased the Airstrip property. Lenora answered vaguely that the owner had essentially lost control of it due to zoning violations, a claim that satisfied most of the residents but left Marissa uneasy enough to start digging through old files after the meeting ended. Buried in a folder she was not meant to open, she found a warning letter from the Federal Land Management Agency instructing the association never to interfere with the aviation corridor. When she brought it to Lenora, the woman snatched the paper from her hands and dismissed it as an outdated notice that no longer applied. The truth, which Graham later laid out plainly to anyone who asked, went back decades. The federal government had built a remote landing strip to support wildfire response mountain rescue operations, the transport of Forest Service personnel, and emergency resupply whenever winter storms cut off the roads. When parts of the surrounding land were eventually released for private use, Graham purchased the adjoining property along with the hangar, but the runway itself, its lighting, and the access corridor remained under federal control. Graham operated as the authorized contractor responsible for maintaining the site, which meant Lenora had not bulldozed a simple private landing strip. She had broken into a restricted federal aviation facility, destroyed government property, and severed a supply route that emergency crews across 3 separate mountain districts depended on. Graham met the surveyor, Elias Fordham, at a quiet diner outside town, where the older man spread a certified land map across the table, its boundary lines stamped with a federal seal. Elias confirmed that the association had formally requested a transfer of the property 6 months earlier and had been denied in writing proof that Lenora had known the true legal status of the land long before she ever ordered a single bulldozer through the gate. He traced his finger along a red boundary line and told Graham plainly that the hangar belonged to him, but the runway, the lighting system, and the entire stretch of ground the crews had flattened belonged to the government of the United States. When Graham asked how serious this made things, Elias didn't hesitate. They hadn't just destroyed federal property, he said. They had cut off the only emergency supply route serving 3 mountain districts. Back at the wreckage site, Graham combed through the paperwork Lenora had left behind and found one inconsistency after another. The violation notice bore the county seal but carried the wrong case number. The demolition order lacked a judge's signature entirely. The name of a building inspector who had retired years earlier appeared on the permit as though he had personally approved it. The attached map had been altered to erase every symbol indicating federal ownership, and worst of all, a document titled Voluntary Waiver of Runway Access Rights bore a signature claiming to be Graham's, though he had never seen the paper before in his life. He called Daphne Caldwell, the association's attorney, and asked whether she had reviewed the demolition order before it was carried out. Daphne sounded genuinely confused, explaining that Lenora had only asked her to draft a noise complaint notice and had never requested authorization for any demolition. When Graham sent her photographs of the crushed aircraft, she immediately called Lenora and demanded the project be halted at once. Lenora's response was to tell her the work was already finished and that the entire board needed to get their story straight before anyone else started asking questions. That same week, Lenora summoned Warren Pike to her house and pressed him to keep quiet about what had actually happened. Over the course of their conversation, it became clear she had told him. Graham voluntarily sold the land, had handed him a forged demolition permit, had paid him $75,000 up front from association funds, and had personally instructed the crew to erase every federal marking they came across before crushing the aircraft, so Graham would have no reason left to return. Warren grew visibly nervous once he remembered that one of his own workers had filmed Lenora pointing directly at the plane and telling the crew to run it over. Around the same time, Special Agent Rosalind Barrett arrived in Redstone Hollow without notifying local authorities, setting up a discreet perimeter around the destroyed airstrip and meeting privately with Graham. She asked him to keep the federal status of the land quiet for the time being, hoping Lenora would continue believing this was nothing more than an ordinary property dispute, while investigators quietly built their case. Over the following days, federal technicians measured tread marks, recovered footage from damaged security cameras, examined the torn warning signs, calculated the value of the destroyed navigation equipment, and tested the soil for leaking aviation fuel that could pose an environmental hazard. Preliminary estimates already placed the damage above $2,400,000 without even accounting for the disruption to emergency rescue operations. Undeterred, Lenora filed paperwork with the local court, seeking formal recognition of the association's control over the land, all while sending Graham a new letter demanding payment for demolition costs, ordering him to surrender the hangar keys, banning him from returning to the site, and threatening criminal charges for trespassing on what she called community property. Reviewing the letter, Graham realized she was trying to construct a paper trail suggesting she had controlled the land long before the destruction ever took place. It was around this time that investigators reviewing the security footage found something Lenora clearly never expected anyone to see. On the recording, Lenora walked up to a survey marker stamped with the words United States Government Property, read the inscription aloud, and turned to Warren with an instruction that would haunt her for the rest of the case. "Pull it out," she told him. "If there's no marker, there's no dispute." Agent Barrett paused the footage and looked at Graham without saying a word for a long moment. She knew Graham finally said. Barrett nodded slowly and explained exactly what that single sentence meant for the case moving forward. It had just transformed a reckless act into deliberate, premeditated destruction of federal property, and there was no walking that back. Believing she still had the upper hand, Lenora organized a press event outside the entrance to Silver Pines Estates, publicly accusing Graham of running an unlicensed airstrip, generating dangerous noise pollution, storing hazardous fuel near residential homes, and using the cover of rescue work to operate what she called an unauthorized commercial aviation business. She played a heavily edited clip in which Graham appeared to say that everyone involved would pay a price, deliberately cutting the sentence before he finished explaining he meant paying for every piece of equipment they had destroyed. The doctored clip spread through the neighborhood quickly enough that a number of residents who had never met Graham began treating him as the villain of the story, some even planting handmade signs near the property demanding the airstrip be shut down permanently. Deputy Briggs arrived at the site not long after with a temporary order barring Graham from the property signed by a local judge who had been given nothing but Lenora's version of events. Graham handed over the gate key without protest, but warned Nolan calmly that he was walking directly into an active federal investigation zone. Nolan brushed the warning off as an exaggeration meant to intimidate him right up until Agent Barrett appeared behind the tape line, presented her credentials, and ordered him off the property immediately. She didn't explain the full scope of the case, but she made the boundaries unmistakably clear. No one from the county was authorized to move equipment, grant HOA access, or enforce local orders on land under federal jurisdiction, and any further interference would be treated as obstruction. In a closed-door meeting, Marissa pressed Lenora to release the association's complete records to the board, a request Lenora refused outright while accusing Marissa of disloyalty in front of the other members. Quietly, Marissa began copying everything she could find. Emails exchanged with the golf course developer, a wire transfer confirmation for $75,000, the altered property map, the federal rejection letter Lenora had tried to bury, text messages in which Lenora ordered the survey marker removed, and buried at the bottom of a folder a private contract promising Lenora $450,000 in consulting fees the moment the land was cleared and handed over. It confirmed what Marissa had begun to suspect for days. Lenora had never destroyed the airstrip for the community's benefit. She had destroyed it to enrich herself. Graham was summoned before an emergency county hearing, where Lenora appeared with her attorney and a crowd of supportive residents, demanding the county seize his land, fine him $500,000, approve construction of the golf course, and force him to cover every dollar of grading costs. Graham arrived, carrying nothing more than a thin folder of documents. When asked whether he intended to contest the association's claim to the airstrip, he told the room he had no objection to raising because the association had never held any legal claim to it in the first place. Lenora smiled, mistaking his composure for defeat right up until the doors at the back of the hearing room opened. Elias Fordham walked in, flanked by two federal attorneys, and unrolled a large certified map across the table at the front of the room, pointing directly at the destroyed stretch of land. He told the board without a trace of hesitation that the property in question belonged to none of them. Not to Mr. Mercer, not to the association, not even to the county. Lenora's voice wavered slightly as she asked who it belonged to instead. Elias looked straight at her and answered plainly, "The United States of America." The mood of the room shifted entirely as Elias walked the board through decades of ownership records, tracing the airstrip back to its construction and confirming that Graham had only ever held title to the surrounding land and the hangar, while the runway itself remained under federal control, through a maintenance and access agreement carried out on Graham's behalf. He noted that the association had received formal written notice about this arrangement 6 months earlier, and that Lenora herself had signed for delivery of that letter. Daphne immediately requested a recess to speak privately with her client, but Lenora waved her off, insisting the government had abandoned the property long ago and no longer held any claim to it. Elias produced a full year of operational records to counter that claim, directly listing 17 wildfire support flights, 9 equipment, transport missions for mountain rescue teams, 4 emergency evacuations of federal personnel, dozens of hours of maintenance work paid for out of government funds. This was not an abandoned airstrip by any measure. Federal Prosecutor Miles Rourke stepped forward and outlined the range of charges now under review, including unauthorized entry onto federal property, deliberate destruction of government assets, forgery of official documents, wire fraud, destruction of aviation equipment, obstruction of emergency operations, interference with a federal investigation, and conspiracy to seize control of public land through fraudulent means. Lenora still tried to insist her crew had merely followed the permits they were given, until Graham produced a copy of a letter she herself had written to the government months earlier, in which she stated plainly that if the agency didn't remove the airstrip voluntarily, Silver Pines Estates would do it themselves. Her own words proved she had always understood exactly whose land she was destroying. Following the hearing, Agent Barrett requested and received a warrant to search the association's offices, and federal agents seized computers, financial records, board members' phones, the golf course development contract documents bearing forged signatures, footage of the bulldozer crossing the property line, and invoices paid directly out of resident association fees. As agents began cataloging evidence, Lenora attempted to leave the building carrying a box of files, only to be stopped and instructed to set it down. Inside were a portable paper shredder and the original copies of the federal warning letters she had spent months trying to erase from every record she could find. Meanwhile, Marissa reached out privately to Agent Barrett, offering to cooperate fully in exchange for the case, taking into account her limited role in the deception. She handed over a recording from an earlier board meeting, in which Lenora had stated almost casually that once the airstrip disappeared, the government would never pay to rebuild it, and the land would simply become theirs by default. Warren, wrestling with his own conscience, turned over the video showing Lenora ordering the plane-crushed footage that left no room for doubt about who had given the command. In it, Lenora is seen pointing directly at the aircraft, ordering it pushed clear of the hangar, instructing the bulldozer to grind the remaining wing into scrap, and telling the crew that destroying the plane would leave Graham with no reason to ever come back. Agent Barrett later showed Lenora a still frame captured from that same footage, one that placed her standing directly beside the federal marker map in hand, motioning the machine forward. She asked whether Lenora still wanted to claim she never knew this was federal property. For the first time since the investigation began, Lenora said nothing at all, and her phone was sealed inside an evidence bag moments later. Even after her first arrest, Lenora refused to back down. She hired a private criminal defense attorney and publicly claimed the federal government was targeting her, simply because she had tried to protect her neighbors. In an online meeting with the board, she framed the entire investigation as an attempt by Graham and federal agents to steal community land out from under the residents, urging people to donate to a legal defense fund gather at the airstrip in protest, refused to cooperate with investigators, and sign a statement affirming that the destroyed runway had always posed a danger to the neighborhood. Her plan began to fall apart the moment residents started asking pointed questions about the $450,000 payment earmarked for her alone, and she cut the meeting short before anyone could press further. Afterward, Lenora summoned Marissa to her house and demanded she sign a fabricated meeting record claiming the entire board had unanimously approved the destruction of the airstrip. Marissa refused outright. Lenora responded with a string of threats, promising to shift the entire financial liability onto Marissa, accuse her publicly of embezzlement, release selectively edited emails designed to make her look guilty, and use association penalties to threaten the loss of her own home. Marissa, prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation, recorded every word of it. While that confrontation was unfolding, Graham worked alongside a team of engineers assessing whether the airstrip could ever be restored, and the damage proved far worse than anyone initially believed. Drainage pipes had been shattered, the runway bed dug far deeper than necessary, navigation wiring severed throughout fuel tanks, punctured, and the emergency beacon system crushed beyond repair. Scattered fragments of metal littered the ground, posing a serious risk to any aircraft attempting to use the strip before a full cleanup could be completed. Graham's plane, the one he had spent 9 years painstakingly restoring from a fuselage that had once served wildfire crews decades earlier, was beyond saving. He allowed himself a private moment of grief over it, but he never let that anger take control of his actions, telling Agent Barrett plainly that he wanted accountability, based on the evidence, not revenge, dressed up as justice. Growing increasingly desperate, Lenora met Warren privately at an equipment yard and pressured him to burn the bulldozer used in the demolition, hoping to destroy the physical evidence entirely. When he refused, she offered him an additional $100,000 to change his mind, and when he still refused, she threatened to tell investigators he had acted entirely on his own without her knowledge. Warren had already agreed to wear a recording device provided by Agent Barrett, capturing every word of the exchange. During that same conversation, Lenora let slip that the golf course contract needed to be signed within 48 hours, and that if she failed to deliver a clean, undisputed parcel of land in time, she would lose the secret payment entirely and be forced to return the deposit already collected. That single admission gave investigators everything they needed to add witness tampering and obstruction of justice to the growing list of charges against her. Sensing the walls closing in, Lenora discovered that Marissa had been cooperating with federal agents and broke into the association offices late at night in a desperate attempt to remove the backup server before anyone could examine it. Further, Graham happened to be driving past the neighborhood at that exact moment, spotted her car near the building, and immediately alerted Agent Barrett. Federal agents arrived just as Lenora was disconnecting the hard drive, and when she realized she had been caught, she bolted for her car, tearing through a side gate and narrowly missing a parked federal vehicle in her attempt to escape. The brief chase ended when her car slid off the road into a drainage ditch beside the golf course that had never actually been built. Agent Barrett opened the driver's door and ordered her out, but Lenora kept insisting the land belonged to the association and that federal agents had no authority to arrest her on it. Barrett secured the handcuffs and told her calmly and without any satisfaction in her voice that this arrest had nothing to do with the property dispute at all. She then read the preliminary charges aloud, ending with conspiracy to destroy evidence in an active federal investigation. Released on strict conditions while awaiting trial, Lenora was barred from contacting any board members entering the association offices, reaching out to Warren or Marissa, disposing of or transferring any assets, or approaching the federal airstrip under any circumstance. Daphne formally withdrew as the association's attorney once she realized her legal services had unknowingly been used to shield an ongoing fraud that Lenora had deliberately kept hidden from her. A special meeting of Silver Pines Estates residents was convened under the supervision of a court-appointed administrator, and Marissa stood before the full community to lay out the association's finances in complete detail for court-appointed administrator. The very first time, $75,000 had gone to Warren's demolition company. $38,000 had been spent producing forged permits and survey documents. $62,000 had quietly flowed to consulting firms with direct ties to Lenora herself. A hidden commission of $450,000 had been arranged for her personally. A cooperation fee of $3,800,000 had been promised by the development company, and the $186,000 she had originally tried to bill Graham was never about recovering demolition costs at all. It had been an attempt to disguise how much association money she had already stolen and spent. Residents grew furious, learning their own association dues had funded the destruction of property that never belonged to their community in the first place, and several who had once stood outside protesting Graham's airstrip now approached him quietly to apologize. Graham chose not to use the moment to embarrass anyone, explaining instead how Lenora had deliberately concealed the true property map while stoking fears about noise fire risk and falling home values to keep residents compliant and unquestioning. Sheriff Conrad Hale announced that Deputy Briggs had been suspended pending the outcome of the investigation for enforcing documents that were never properly verified. Nolan turned over a string of text messages showing how relentlessly Lenora had pressured him throughout the ordeal, urging the department to intimidate Graham, insisting the county board had already approved the demolition, promising campaign support for certain local officials, and threatening to report Nolan personally if he refused to cooperate with her demands. He admitted with some difficulty that he had trusted Lenora's influence far more than he had bothered to verify the actual facts of the case. Shortly afterward, the association's board voted overwhelmingly to remove Lenora from her position entirely, and the remaining members dissolved the current governing structure, altogether transferring every record into the hands of an independent administrator. Defying the terms of her release, Lenora showed up outside the meeting anyway, shouting that Marissa had betrayed the community and that Graham had manipulated the federal government into stealing land that belonged to the residents. Agent Barrett approached and warned her to leave immediately. Lenora turned to the crowd instead, insisting they would all lose their homes because of Graham's actions. Graham calmly replied that he had never once asked the association to pay its debts with residents' homes and that his goals had always been limited to restoring the airstrip, recovering the value of his destroyed aircraft, holding the responsible decision-makers accountable, and protecting innocent homeowners from a debt Lenora alone had created. His composure drained every bit of power out of her attempt to incite the crowd. Marissa handed Agent Barrett one final piece of evidence, an email Lenora had sent the developer before the destruction even took place, stating plainly that once the plane disappeared along with the runway, Mercer would have no way to continue operating and would eventually be forced to sell whatever private land remained. It confirmed that the scheme had never been limited to destroying federal property. It had always been designed to strip Graham of his own private land as well. Miles Rourke soon announced that a federal grand jury had approved a formal indictment, and Lenora was arrested for a second time, this time in front of the very residents who had once cheered for her. As she was led away, she looked back at Graham and told him he had destroyed this community. He looked back at her and answered simply that he had only stopped her from burying the evidence beneath a golf course. The case moved to federal trial, where Lenora faced charges including deliberate destruction of federal property, conspiracy to seize control of public land, forgery of official documents, financial fraud, witness tampering, obstruction of a federal investigation, destruction of aviation equipment, and misuse of association funds. Her defense argued that she had acted purely in the community's interest, genuinely believing the airstrip had been abandoned by the government years earlier. Prosecutor Miles Rourke called his witnesses one by one, beginning with Elias Fordham, who laid out the certified maps, the maintenance records, the original warning letter, Lenora's own signature, confirming receipt of it, and the formal rejection of her earlier request to acquire the land. Warren Pike testified about the direct order to crush the aircraft, and when the defense attempted to portray him as someone simply trying to avoid responsibility, prosecutors played the recorded conversation in which Lenora offered him money to destroy the bulldozer used in the demolition. Marissa presented the financial records and the recorded threats made against her, while Deputy Briggs confirmed under oath that Lenora had supplied him with falsified paperwork and pressured local law enforcement into keeping Graham away from the site. Graham was the final witness called to the stand. He described without exaggeration how the airstrip functioned as a critical link for wildfire response and mountain rescue operations throughout the region. Rather than dwelling on the emotional loss of his aircraft, he focused instead on the practical consequences of its destruction. A single equipment transport had to be rerouted to an airfield 140 miles away. Wildfire response times in the surrounding district slowed considerably. The federal government was forced to fund a temporary replacement facility. Fuel runoff had contaminated the surrounding soil, and mountain rescue operations across the region had been disrupted for months. When the defense asked whether he was simply seeking revenge against Lenora, Graham answered that if revenge had been his goal, he would have stood in front of cameras and turned the community against her from the very beginning. Instead, he said, he had done nothing more than preserve the evidence and contact the appropriate authorities. The turning point of the trial came when prosecutors played the full, unedited security footage for the jury. It showed Lenora spotting the federal warning sign, ordering it removed, reading the inscription on the survey marker, aloud instructing Warren to pull it out of the ground, directing the crew to crush the aircraft, and declaring that if everything was destroyed completely, the government would never bother coming back for it. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. There was no longer any way for the defense to argue she hadn't known exactly what she was doing. Against her attorney's advice, Lenora chose to testify in her own defense, convinced she could still win the jury over. She claimed Graham had essentially set a trap for the association by failing to post clearer warnings about the land's true status. In response, prosecutors introduced 14 separate warning letters, documented minutes from 3 different meetings, and formal records confirming her attendance at each one. Miles asked her directly how many times the federal government needed to warn her before she would stop destroying its property. Lenora lost her composure entirely, shouting that no one had the right to interfere with her efforts to protect property values in her community. In that single outburst, the jury finally saw the person she truly was beneath every carefully rehearsed explanation. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. Lenora stood still, clinging to the same defiant posture she had carried throughout the entire trial. The clerk began reading the charges one after another. Count 1 guilty, count 2 guilty. And the reading continued in that same steady rhythm until every single charge against her had been read into the record. At sentencing, prosecutors presented the full scope of the damage. Federal property losses exceeded $2,400,000. Graham's personal losses, including the aircraft and destroyed equipment, approached $900,000. Additional costs covered environmental remediation, the temporary replacement airstrip disrupted rescue operations, and the extensive recovery of digital evidence. Alongside every dollar of association funds Lenora had misused along the way. Many residents wrote letters to the court explaining that they too had been victims of Lenora's deception, unaware of the truth until the case unraveled in front of them. Graham asked the court not to force innocent homeowners to lose their properties over a debt they had never knowingly created. He proposed instead that restitution be pursued first through Lenora's personal assets, the hidden commission she had arranged for herself, the shell companies used to disguise payments, the demolition company's liability insurance, the development firm that had entered into the scheme, and any board members who had knowingly approved the fraudulent spending. The judge acknowledged that Graham had conducted himself responsibly throughout, despite suffering significant personal loss. Given the opportunity to speak, Lenora offered no apology to Graham, to the residents, or to the government. She insisted she had simply been someone willing to take action, and that any mistakes made along the way belonged to the people beneath her. Marissa lowered her head, visibly disappointed by what she heard. The judge stated plainly that Lenora's greatest failure was never a simple misunderstanding about a property line. It was the fact that she had known the truth from the beginning. Torn down the warning signs anyway, forged documents to claim authority she never possessed, spent residents' money without their knowledge, destroyed equipment used for life-saving rescue missions, threatened witnesses into silence, attempted to erase evidence, and continued lying under oath, even as the truth surrounded her on every side. Lenora received a lengthy federal prison sentence, was ordered to pay significant personal restitution, forfeited every dollar of the illicit commission she had arranged, was permanently barred from holding any leadership role within a residential association again, and was prohibited from participating in any future contracts involving public land. Warren received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, though his business license was suspended for a period, and he too was ordered to pay restitution. Board members who had knowingly approved the fraudulent payments faced their own separate legal consequences. The development company withdrew from the golf course project entirely and reached a settlement to avoid a prolonged legal battle of its own. Silver Pines Estates was placed under temporary independent oversight, and the association's fee structure was restructured so residents would not be forced to shoulder the full weight of Lenora's actions. Deputy Briggs was eventually reinstated after completing his disciplinary period, though he was required to undergo additional training on verifying civil orders and understanding jurisdictional boundaries before enforcing them again. He visited Graham personally to admit that he had allowed Lenora's influence to replace his own judgment, and that he should have verified the evidence long before acting on her word alone. Graham accepted the apology, but reminded him gently that the more power someone holds, the more their claims deserve to be checked rather than simply trusted. As Lenora was led out of the courtroom for the final time, she turned back for one last look at Graham. She had once believed a bulldozer could erase every legal boundary standing in her way. Now the very warning sign she had ordered ripped from the ground stood as evidence before the jury that convicted her of nearly everything she had tried so hard to hide. A year later, Aviation Station 14 stood rebuilt on the same ground where it had once been destroyed. The new facility featured a reinforced runway bed, an improved drainage system, modern approach lighting, federal security cameras, reinforced perimeter fencing, a newly constructed hangar, an environmentally compliant fuel station, and warning. Signage large enough that no one could ever again claim to have missed it. Part of the funding came directly from restitution payments and seized assets, while the federal government covered the remainder in recognition of how vital the rescue corridor truly was to the surrounding region. The old de Havilland Beaver could never be fully restored. Graham kept one section of the wing still marked by the bulldozer's tracks and mounted it on the wall of the new hangar. It wasn't meant as a symbol of loss. It served instead as a quiet reminder that the law only means something when the person it was used against stays steady enough to use it correctly. Graham received a replacement aircraft upgraded and better suited to the demands of the mountain missions he continued to fly. Silver Pines Estates changed as well. Residents elected a new board and adopted a set of rules meant to prevent anything like this from happening again. Every major expenditure now required full disclosure. Every boundary dispute required an independent survey. No single board member could approve a contract that personally benefited them. Every meeting had to be recorded. Residents were guaranteed access to financial records, and the association was permanently barred from unilaterally expanding its own jurisdiction. Marissa chose not to run for the presidency herself, instead joining a newly formed transparency committee to help repair some of the damage she felt responsible for having allowed to continue in silence for so long. A group of residents made their way to the airstrip to apologize to Graham, directly helping replant the trees that had been cut down and restoring the surrounding grounds around the facility. Graham never joined the homeowners association himself, and he never handed over any control of his land to them either. But he did agree to host a short presentation explaining exactly what the airstrip was used for, so residents could finally understand the purpose behind the runway they had once been told to fear. The first flight after the facility reopened carried equipment for a wildfire crew stationed deep in the mountains. Sheriff Conrad Hale, Agent Barrett Elias Fordham, Marissa, and a handful of residents gathered behind the new perimeter fence to watch. Graham climbed into the cockpit, ran through his checklist, and glanced once at the old section of wing mounted inside the hangar. He thought back to the day Lenora had stood on the ruined runway, fully convinced she had already won. She had the bulldozers, the money, the influence, and an entire board willing to follow her lead without question. Graham had nothing but a folder of records, a handful of security footage, and the patience to wait for the truth to surface on its own terms. But the truth never needed to shout louder than the lie standing across from it. It only needed to be preserved long enough to reach the place where it finally mattered. The engine roared to life as the plane gathered speed along the rebuilt runway, lifting off the ground and banking toward the distant mountains. Looking down at Silver Pines Estates as it grew smaller beneath him, Graham saw the golf course that had never been built and never would be. On the stretch of land Lenora had once tried to claim for herself stood a new sign, impossible for anyone to overlook federal property. All trespassing and destruction subject to prosecution. Lenora had once believed she could flatten a runway, crush an aircraft, and bury every trace of evidence beneath fresh soil, but she made one mistake she could never undo. She assumed private property simply meant no one held enough power to defend it right up until the moment the federal government proved otherwise.